Hello everybody and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's video, we're going to get this little component here turned into a couple of drawer runners. Let's get going. Right, so this part of the project is great because we get to intentionally put a gap in something for once. Let me explain. So the drawer runners are going to be situated at the bottom of the cabinet and they're going to be nested between these two stretchers we got here, and they'll be sort of running along here and along here as well. And we're going to be leaving a 2 or 3 millimeter gap on the back shoulder of the drawer runner to account for wood expansion and contraction. Because as you may or may not know, wood will expand and contract depending on the humidity of the environment it's within. If it's a dry environment, the wood is likely to shrink, and if it's quite a humid environment, then the wood is likely to expand. And the rate and volatility of this expansion depends on a lot of things, such as the humidity percentage of the environment, perhaps the species of wood itself, and even the cut of wood that you're working with, whether it's quarter sawn or through sawn. So wood tends to expand and contract across the grain. So in the instance of this cabinet, with the grain running up like this, it's going to get wider. What it does not do is get longer. I mean, it does to a very, very small extent, but it's negligible. So unless you're working on absolutely massive components, it's not worth worrying about. On something this size, it's not really going to get any taller along the grain. It does, however, get bigger and smaller across the grain like this. This means that this cabinet in particular is either going to get deeper or it's going to get shallower front to back. However, if we look at it from the front like this, because the grain on these stretches is going along like this, remember what we said? It does not get smaller along the grain. So this size is likely to stay the same. These components will to some extent get smaller and bigger because again it will be across the grain, but because it's such a thin component, again that's going to be negligible. When you compare it to the width of this, we've got to account for quite a lot of movement with this. Now that means when we put the runners in the bottom of the cabinet, we're going to have a bit of cross-grain construction going on, because if we make this component a snug fit between these two stretchers, then as this cabinet tries to get smaller and wider according to the relative humidity, the long grain of this component is going to be restricting this gap from closing primarily. Now we've all heard the term something's got to give, and when it comes to wood, you cannot stop that wood movement from happening. So in the case of this, because that gap is unable to get any smaller because it's restricted by this component, we're going to get a gap open in the middle instead. These components are still going to shrink, but they will shrink outwards as opposed to in, like this, thus ruining our lovely edge joint that we tried so hard to get completely seamless in a previous episode. Now there are various ways to account for the expansion and contraction of a project when it comes to fitting things like this, but in the case of this project, what we're going to be doing is cutting a tongue onto either end of these drawer runners. The front tongue is going to be a standard nice tight fit that we would normally strive to achieve when it comes to cutting joinery. But the back one is going to have a 2 millimeter gap at the end of the tongue and a 2 millimeter gap on the shoulders as well, and it's going to be completely loose. The front one will glue in place, the back one, nothing in there. It's going to be free to move around as the humidity changes. Now this gap is not really going to be visible because it's going to be in the back corner of the cabinet, and also it's going to be hidden behind the drawer, so unless you take the drawer out, look right in the back corner of the cabinet, then you're unlikely to see it. So it's not anything worth worrying about. Now, obviously, if you're using the plans, then you can just follow them to size this component. But just in case you're not, this is how I would go about doing it. So if we were trying to get a really snug fit between these two components, I would firstly measure the gap to start with, which is about 102 millimeters. And if I was cutting a tongue to fit into this component and this component, I'd probably make it go in about 6 millimeters, or 1/4 of an inch for those of you across the pond. So what I would do is move the ruler onto this component by 6 millimeters. So now 6 millimeters lines up with the corner on here, and I can see that we are now at 108 millimeters on the corner here. We then add 6 millimeters onto that, which is 114, and that would be the overall size of the component that I would need to cut to, and then have a 6 millimeter tongue on either side. But as I just said, we're not going for a snug fit here. I'm going to take off about 2 millimeters. So instead of cutting it to 114, we're going to cut the component to 112 instead, but still mark a 6 millimeter shoulder on the front and a 6 millimeter shoulder on the back here. Likewise, we're still going to cut the mortise to 6 millimeters and the mortise to 6 millimeters on the back as well. Now, I appreciate that's quite a lot to take in, but it will make more sense when you get started. Right, so before marking anything out, let's just double check that we are in fact mortising on the bottom of the cabinet as opposed to the top. This is the bottom. Double check that from my face side and face edge marks, and also my numbering system shows that this is the top of the cabinet and this is the back and everything like that. See, look at that, no ambiguity whatsoever. When I'm cutting things like mortises or dominoes or anything like that, I just put some rough marks in the area that I'm going to be cutting into. That way, when I take it apart, I can easily see that that area I've scribbled is the area that waste needs to be removed from. It's not the clean components here, or I'm not accidentally going to mortise this bit on the front side of the cabinet. A rough mark like that is really useful for confirming where you're cutting. So the first thing we need to do is just work out a face side and face edge on these two drawer runner components. Now, I want the nicest grain to be face up when you look inside the drawer. I know it's going to be very infrequent, but we might as well do it. So I've got some lovely straight grain going on one of the faces here, and some kind of, it's not too exciting to be honest. So I'll make those rather unexciting faces the edges, and then this straight grain bit will be the top of the component when you look inside the drawer. Now, because this is going to be the top, it means that the other side of it is going to be the face side, because that is going to be the face that's going to be flush with the outside of the cabinet. Now we'll flip it over and mark a face side and a face edge on there. Same again on the other one. Let's see, this face looks quite nice, so I'm going to flip it over, and that will be our face side and our face edge. And because of the numbering system we've got on the two bottom components and the two little scribbles that we've got there and the face side mark on here, means that I can just pretty much assemble this as it would be going together. So we've got that. See, face sides flush with the numbered side of the dovetailed stretcher, indicating that that is a face side. And then we look in here, we've got the two scribble marks, and if I flip that round, and there we go. So that is what we're going to be seeing from the bottom of the cabinet where it's flush. And then if I spin it round, that is what we're going to be seeing inside the drawer cavity. So firstly, let's mark the shoulders on the runners and also the mortises on the dovetailed stretchers. You're going to need a marking gauge for this. Set the gauge to 6 millimeters, and that is going to be scratched around both sides of these runners. Now be careful when you do this, because these are quite small components, so a marking gauge can be particularly lethal when working on things of this size. And then as for marking the mortises, there's not a whole lot you can do on these dovetail stretchers other than mark along the end grain next to the dovetail, so then you can see the depth of the mortise from the side. So we'll be referencing this from the little scribble mark we've got on there. Marking gauge gets referenced against that and then scratched along the end grain right next to the tail. Flip it round and do exactly the same from the little mark there as well. And I'm actually going to reassemble the bottom components just to confirm all the shoulder lines and layout that I've done before cutting anything. It is always worth doing this and double checking everything before making the first cut. And so now if we put that drawer runner on and line the shoulder line up here with the edge of the component, the back one is 2 millimeters shy on both the shoulder line, and you can see it's also not nesting in 6 millimeters. Perfect. So when it comes to cutting these out, it's always easier to cut the mortises first, because it's far easier to size a tenon to fit a mortise than it is to size a hole to fit a tenon. And when it comes to the width of this mortise, I'm probably going to cut it to about 7 millimeters wide. The reason for this is because the chisel I want to use is 6.35 millimeters in width, and just in case there's any tiny steps left over after cutting that mortise, I should have 0.5 millimeter either side to clean up afterwards. It'll make more sense when I do it. Now the next thing I want to figure out is how far in I want this mortise to go in terms of width, because I don't want it to obviously peak beyond the drawer runner out the side. Easiest way to do this is get a square on the front like that, get your drawer runner and slide it up until the drawer runner is flush with the shoulder line here, and then keep that in place, take that out, and then carefully scribe a line down like that. So once again on this side, square on like that, pop your drawer runner on, slide it up until it's flush with the shoulder line, and then switch over to your knife. Sorted. And the final measurement to sort out is the overall height of the mortise. Now I've got a 6.35 millimeter chisel here because it's a imperial conversion, so I am going to make the mortise 7 millimeters wide Because this is a 15mm component, it means we'll have 4mm either side of the mortise. It also means that when I've removed the bulk of the waste with this chisel, I'll then be able to go in the sides with a wider chisel and clean up any small lumps and bumps afterwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is set this gauge to 4mm. And from the face side of this component, so in this case the numbered one, make sure you don't do this from the back side because you won't be able to cancel out any errors that way. So from the face side, I'm going to scratch that 4mm mark. We'll do that on all of the components. And then before unlocking that setting on the gauge, we need to scratch over the top of these draw runners as well from that face side. Once again, do not do it from the non-face side or even the face edge for that matter. It's got to be done from the face side if you want this to go flush after assembly. So marking gauge pressed against there and then over the top. Again, be very careful when doing this, please. Right, okay, so we've got one side of the mortise marked out and one side of the tongue marked out as well. So we now need to mark the second line on here. Obviously you could do this with a mortise gauge that has 2 pins and do both those lines simultaneously, but I'd imagine most of you will just have a marking gauge, so that's why we're doing it this way. So we'll have the 4mm shoulder plus the 7mm mortise, which means the next mark we need to do is at 11mm. We'll reset our marking gauge to 11 and then scratch that over the components again, still referencing from that same face side, and that will do your second mark. And as you can see, what that's left us with is 2 lines that are 4mm from the edge with a 7mm gap between them. Now you might be wondering why we didn't just mark 4mm from either edge with that same gauge setting. Firstly, it's good practice to be marking from your face sides and face edges when doing joinery anyway, because it cancels out a lot of errors. And secondly, in the case of this, we've machined this component to 15mm, which means we've been able to achieve 4, 7 and 4. However, if this component, let's say, was machined to 16mm and we scratched around that with our 4mm gauge setting, you won't get 4, 7, then 4. Instead, you'll get 4, 8 and then 4. Therefore, you'll be left with a tenon that is too big to fit in the mortise, and you'll have to take material off either side of here in order to keep it central on this component, and you might end up overdoing it, you might end up making it misaligned, and there's all sorts of problems. And a 1mm difference between the two of these is quite a generous example. That could be off by like 0.5 millimeter, maybe even 1/3 of a millimeter, and you would still kind of have that effect. Whereas because we referenced off one face, we went 4mm, 4mm, and then jumps to the other side of the tenon, therefore marking at 11 and 11, it's always going to leave us with 4, 7, 4. And then in the case of this, if this was 15, that would leave us with 4. And then in the case of this, if that was 16, it would leave us with 5mm there. But you could then just flush off one side with a plane after assembly. Like seriously, if you're not in the habit yet of marking off face sides and face edges using a marking gauge, using a square or using a knife or anything like that, really you need to get in the habit of doing it, because you can get away with small errors when doing joinery like this. But if you're not used to that process when it comes to making the door later in this project, you're going to run into some real problems, let alone the projects later in the school as well, where we focus on bigger mortise and tenons. So I've now got the component clamped in the end vise and I'm ready to start chopping out the mortise. Remember, when you're doing this, look along the length of the component so you can see if the chisel is going in square or not. Because if you're looking at it from the side, you can't actually see if it's going in at 90 degrees or not. You can see this angle going on, but that doesn't matter too much until we get down to cutting this line right here. Because what we really don't want at this point is a mortise going off at an angle. It's not nice to fit a tenon to. So we're going to do a series of small chops to start with, going along the length of the mortise. This bit I expect some end grain to pop off here. There it is. Pop him away and then just keep going back and forth. And just really make sure you stay between those lines. And when the chips stop breaking out, you can just go in from the end here and carefully remove the waste. We'll just keep working down until we get to that 6mm line that we scribed along the end grain earlier. Right, so we're down to depth that way, and we've just got to do this final chop down to the line now. So I'm looking from the front of the component now to check that we're hitting down at 90 degrees from this direction. And then pop the waste out. And then the final thing we can do is put the chisel into the remnants of that gauge line and pare it down to clean up those edges. Right, so with the mortises cut out, the next job is to start cutting the little tongues on the end of these draw runners. You can either cut directly to the line on this, or you can chisel back to the line depending on your confidence with the saw. When it comes to cutting through the end grain of the timber down the length of the draw runners, I'm going to try and cut to the line. But when I'm removing the shoulders, I'm going to leave about 0.5 millimeter to chisel back to afterwards. This is the exact same process I would carry out if I was doing like dovetails, but do whatever you want depending on your confidence. So just to demo that, nice and low in the vise, I'm going to cut directly to the line from the top. And down to the shoulder, same again here, directly to the line, down to the shoulder. And obviously when I'm cutting down from the top, I'm making sure I'm doing it on the waist side. On the edges, cut off the excess, leaving about 0.5 millimeter to the shoulder line. And then I'm just going to flip them around because I find it easier. Nice sharp chisel into that shoulder line and remove the leftover. There we go. What we should be able to do is assemble this with the face sides up. Nice little snap in there, and that holds in very nicely, but it's not too tight either. And because we marked all the joinery from the face sides and face edge, it's meant that the top shoulder on this is perfectly flush. I can't feel any step there whatsoever. Whereas if I was to flip this component over, and this would be the same as marking all those layout lines from this edge as opposed to the face side, if we put those together, there's a step there, meaning that my machining is a little bit dodgy. Oh yeah, there you go. And these components are just ever so slightly different sizes, and I just didn't notice. Right, and there you go, that is how you cut the drawer runners for the bottom of the cabinet. As you can see, we've got a nice 2mm gap at the back, which we accounted for when measuring out the components originally, and that will allow the cabinet to expand and contract front to back with the different humidity in the seasons. If you're making this project in an environment where those swings between humidity are quite large, then you might want to extend that gap to 3mm just to be safe, but realistically these should not be shrinking any more than 2mm. So I hope you found that video useful. If you want to know a little bit more about wood in general when it comes to expansion and contraction, please have a look at the supporting resources below this video. And there's also a few extra topics in there, such as mortise and tenons and using a marking gauge and all those other things that you might find useful when it comes to doing this stage of the build. So as always guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already by pressing the big round button there, and you can move on to the next lesson by pressing the button below. I'll see you in the next one.